What if a coin could start a revolution? What if a small piece of metal could help someone become emperor? And what if power was not only shown in armies or speeches, but in images, symbols, and tiny details most people would never notice? In the first video, we explored what numismatics is and why coins matter. But now, let's go deeper, because sometimes a single coin can tell an entire political story. So how exactly does that work? How can a coin send a political message? How can it influence people without saying a single word? Let's look at a concrete example from the Byzantine world.
Yeah, this is a very, very interesting case where we're in the early 7th century. There is an Emperor Phocas who is, at least according to the sources, very unpopular. He's often called a tyrant, and there are all sorts of reasons why the chronicles describe him like that. But the fact is that there are at least some people that are not so happy with his rule. And then a revolt starts by the exarch, so the local governor, let's say, of Carthage, so ancient Carthago, who's called Heraclius, and who has a son who's also called Heraclius. So this is kind of this is two times the same name, but together they call it the Heracli. And they start a revolt. Because he's the exarch, he has his own army there, so this is actually quite easy. With the help of his brother Gregoras, who's in Egypt, and his son Nicetas. They begin a revolt in Egypt and Byzantine Africa, which is about North Africa right now, except for Egypt, which was a different province. Together they revolt against the rule of Phocas, and then there is very quickly actually a problem. So this starts in 607, 608. What do you do in terms of your coins? So they actually have two choices. You can continue striking coins with the effigy of Phocas, but this is actually highly undesirable, let's say, because Phocas is the emperor you're trying to overthrow. So this would be a problem. The other thing you can do is strike your own coins, proclaiming yourself as emperor. But then the question is, who is going to be the emperor? Because there are 4 people revolting. The second problem is that in the 7th century, before this wouldn't be a problem, but in the 7th century, Constantinople as the capital has an enormous value of making people an emperor. So in other words, to be an emperor, you need Constantinople, you need the Hagia Sophia, you need the Hippodrome, you need the acclamation of the people, you need the Senate. You need that city to become a legitimate emperor. They will not accept you if you are not being crowned in Constantinople. In the past, this was possible. We had acclamations in the provinces in the 4th century, in the 3rd century, and so on. But in the 7th century, the game had really changed. Constantinople had this acceptance system that if anyone who wanted to be an emperor, who wanted to be considered a legitimate emperor, needed this city and all of its rituals in the church and in the Hippodrome to be considered legitimate. So if the Heracli would strike coins depicting themselves as emperors, this would be a huge issue. So what do? And this is a brilliant and a very clever solution. They don't depict themselves as emperors, but they do strike themselves with the coins, not one, but 2, both of the Heracli, Heraclius the elder and Heraclius the younger, depict themselves of the coins as consuls. And then you can ask, okay, what does that mean? Well, consuls, we had consuls since the Roman Republic. There were 2 consuls every year. This was the highest position you had. And then when the Republic gradually morphs into the empires, the consul remains. The emperor becomes a consul once in a while, but then he also is not a consul anymore and we get other consuls. And this continues for almost 1,000 years until 541, when Justinian decides that this whole idea of having 2 consuls when there has been an emperor for over 500 years doesn't really make sense anymore. And he's also afraid that these consuls will take his position. And therefore he abolishes the consulate. So after 541, there are no consuls anymore. But because this is such a highly traditional society, the emperor himself still assumes the consulate as tradition prescribes on the 1st of January after his accession to the throne. And this continues for Justinian, Tiberius, and more emperors until we are in the early 7th century. And when this happens, so when they assume the consulate on the 1st of January as tradition prescribed, they strike coins. Often only gold, later also some bronzes. These are very rare coins that are only struck at that moment and then not anymore, to communicate to the people, look, I am doing what the tradition says, I am assuming the consulate. And they depict the emperor as a consul, but with a crown, because he's also emperor. What the Heracli do, they depict themselves together, so two people instead of the traditional one, without crowns, but with the consular trabea, so the consular garment, let's say. And the titulature, so the legend where the title is, also reads Dominus Noster, our Lord Heraclius, consuli. Not Augustus, there's no title, but consul. And what they do here is very cleverly playing with this republican idea of, oh, there are two consuls, it's like the republic. And they're not emperors, they're not saying they're emperors, they're just consuls trying to restore the republic, for whatever that's worth at this point, and therefore they revolt against Phocas. And this is a very smart way to communicate that they are trying to take the throne without taking the crowning agency from the capital, without offending the Constantinopolitan people by taking their crown from them and saying, oh, we acclaim ourselves like in North Africa. They don't do that. They just take the consulate. But what's the most important thing? At this point, who was the only one who could become consuls? Emperors. So in a sense, by representing yourself as a consul, although it's not imperial, it's also imperial simultaneously, because there is no one else that can become consul. So in this way, the Heracli didn't represent themselves as emperors, but as something only emperors could be, consuls. And this is a very clever propagandistic message that they sent across quite large regions until they get to the throne. Heraclius is successful. He is crowned Emperor of Byzantium, and then they never depict any emperor as consul again, because it has shown in this example between 608 610 the potential of being depicted as a consul was enormous, and this is a dangerous precedent for usurpations, and therefore Heraclius and all of his successors are not depicted as consuls anymore. Also not when they assume the consulate. So this tradition still continues until the 9th century, but the consular coinage is gone. It's one last time used to help a father and his son illegally usurp the throne, and therewith they were the last Roman consuls on coinage.
So a coin is never just a coin. It can be strategy, it can be communication, it can even be manipulation. But to really understand this, we need to look closer, not just at the idea of coins, but at the coins themselves. What do they actually look like? What do they show? And how do historians read them?
So I mainly study iconography, so what are coinage, what are they depicting, and I do that quantitatively. So I have a database of coin types and coin specimens also. And what I study is in the long term, so in a long-term framework of 4 centuries, how do coins change? How do the image of the ruler change? How does the image on the reverse change? What happens to the titulature? And analyzing this from a quantitative perspective. And this doesn't mean that coins that are very rare are not important. They can be important because they are rare, but it's always good to keep in mind how common is this message and what agency can I attribute to this message. And for example, to return to consular issues, the consul, the emperor as a consul on coinage, on gold is always extremely rare. So then we cannot say, okay, this is a message for everyone. No, this is a message for a very, very small specific group. And in my view, this group is probably the people that were actually there when the emperor assumed the consulate. It would be this small ceremony of obviously not everyone was invited. And the people that were invited were maybe given these coins as something to remember, as a token. And then it's not, I mean, it is still money, but it's not used in a monetary manner. It's more like a gift. And probably the people that would be there would be senators, because for senators, if you're in the Senate, the consul is the head of the Senate, and senators are the important acceptance group within Constantinople that actually really finds it important that the emperor still assumes this ancient function, even though it doesn't really have any meaning anymore. But for them, it makes them relevant. If the emperor is a consul, they are relevant as the Senate, and therefore the Senate is probably present at the ceremony, and this message of the emperor as a consul on coins is probably meant for them. So this is an example where you have very specific, so even rare coins can be interesting, but you have to ask different questions.
So not every coin speaks to everyone. Some coins are everywhere. Others are incredibly rare. Some are everyday objects. Others are almost like messages for insiders. But that raises another question.
One of the things then that we should really distinguish is you have two forms of propaganda. You have agitation propaganda on the one hand, and you have integration propaganda on the other hand. And agitation propaganda is really what we know from the 20th century, what we know from our world now, which is propaganda that is really used to change people's minds about something. So this is really a call for action. Like, you see this in the media, or we hope that you change your mind, you change your opinion, and that you will get angry about this, for example. That's not what happens on ancient coins, because they're not that fast. Instead, it's integration propaganda. With integration propaganda, it's about endlessly sending the same message over and over again, the same visual framework, which is then automatically integrated into the status quo, and that will actually show you that the emperor is always depicted with a laurel red. Therefore, anyone who wears a laurel red will be an emperor at some point, at least when they're depicted on the coins. Or even more simply, just the fact that a bust of the emperor appears on the obverse of the coins is already an imperial statement in itself, because there is no one that is depicted there except the emperor. So if you appear on a coin on the obverse, that by definition makes you the emperor. And that is only the case because this has been a propagandic message that has been sent for centuries and centuries and centuries. And therefore you could even say, in terms of the Heraclius as well, this is what we call striking legitimacy. By just appearing there, you are making the claim that you are an emperor, because there's no one else who can appear there. And before the emperors were on the coins, there were the gods. So this also says something about the relevance of where you are. And it's still the case. I mean, who is depicted on our coins? It's not your neighbors, probably, you know, or you live in a very famous neighborhood. But the people on the coins are people that matter and that people know. And this is a form of propaganda, but it's different from how we view propaganda from the 20th century. But nonetheless, it's important, and it should be considered with all the respect, I think. And I think this is happening a lot more than the debate in the 1950s.
So far, we've talked about coins as ideas, as messages, as tools of power. But what happens when we actually look at real coins? Not in theory, but in practice. What do they really look like? How big are they? Who were they made for? And how much can we actually see when we hold them in our hands? Because sometimes the details we talk about are much smaller than we imagine. So let's take a closer look at some real examples.
One of the things what important is with coins is the material circumstances. So one of the examples is that coinage, especially bronze coins, are often not stable. So they will begin quite big, get smaller, 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 and sometimes they get so small that you can barely, I hope the camera picked this up, you can barely hold them anymore. And then at this point, the coins are not handable anymore. I mean, I can barely hold this in my hands, which is problematic. You can not really read the legend anymore, and then you should really question how much visual agency do these coins still have, but also economically, what does it mean? This is probably not a good sign of the economy. It does get fixed, however. This is a coin of Marcian, so we're in the mid-5th century. In the late 5th century, we certainly have quite a larger coin. So then they fix it again, but then it doesn't stay so stable. So this is one of the material realities of coins that we have to be aware about. So look at the weight, look at the diameter. What is the message actually supposed to convey? There's a famous anecdote once of a numismatist who attributed a lot of value to a certain symbol on a coin, but then when other people looked at this coin, the symbol was about 1 millimeter big. So are people really going to catch this detail? And we have, of course, these great images, but that's not how the coins actually look like. So the material reality of coinage is something to always keep in mind when you're studying this. So sometimes thinking about audience in terms of coins is also a useful construct. There are mostly 3 metal classes, so gold, silver, bronze, although silver and gold are not always struck that much. These are often targeted towards completely different groups. And one of the things you can see, for example, this is a gold coin from the 5th century, where the emperor appears as a soldier, complete with helmet, military spear, shield, and things like that. And these coins were also used to pay soldiers. So we know that soldiers were used in solidi, in the gold coin, and therefore the emperor depicts himself as a soldier because he knows that the primary target audience of this gold coin is going to be soldiers, and therefore there's a connection between the iconography on the obverse of the coins and the targeted audience that we have on this specific metal class. And then in terms of Christianity, I told you earlier about that it takes a long time. It takes 4 centuries before Christian symbols really take over. Then for the first time we get Christ himself on the gold coin. The emperor goes to the reverse. He's merely a servant of Christ now, and this is a whole new conceptualization of emperorship. It takes a long time before Christian symbols to actually become for any Byzantine coins to become completely Christianized, because in 1969 there are bronze coins struck with, on the obverse, Christ himself, and on the reverse it just says Jesus Christ, King of Kings, Basileus Basileios. So there is no imperial message here at all anymore. And we talked about how important it is that the emperor is always on the obverse and then later he's on the reverse, but being on the coin makes you an emperor. This was the case for centuries, since Caesar is the first living Roman to appear on the coin, and this is a precedent that is followed by every other emperor after that. But here the emperor decides, at least for the bronzes, he still appears on gold and silver. The bronzes can be just Christian symbols, and this I would say is the complete Christianization of coinage, because here there is no imperial message present at all anymore. Not even in the title. It's just a coin of Christ and a title of Christ, which also makes it incredibly difficult to date, because the Christ is always there, and this is really difficult to attribute these to specific reigns of emperors. This is a consular issue of Maurice. So these are these consular bronzes that were struck in the late 6th century, where the emperor appears with a mappa, so the consular symbol, and an eagle-tipped scepter, and in the consular robes, but with imperial titles and with a crown. So this is a consular statement. I am the consul, I assume the consulate, but he's also still depicted as an emperor. And what Heraclius do is depict himself with the consular attributes, but without the imperial part. And this is the interesting interplay.
So coins don't just show power, they reinforce it. Not by shocking people, not by changing minds overnight, but by repeating the same message again and again and again. Until it feels normal, until it feels natural, until it feels true. And maybe that's what makes them so powerful. Not what they say once, but what they say constantly. So the next time you see a coin, look a little closer, because even the smallest details might carry the biggest messages. Thank you for watching. If you want to explore more about how stories shape Eurasia, subscribe to the channel and join us on the next episode of Eurasian Transformations.